My name is Cassidy Vance, and I deal in the cold, hard logic of movement. For 11 years, I've managed high-stakes supply chain operations from a high-rise in Chicago, tracking millions of dollars in global freight across oceans and borders. In my world, things don't just vanish. There is always a manifest, always a timestamp, always a trail. If a shipping container goes missing in the middle of the Atlantic, I can tell you exactly which bolt sheared off and at what millisecond it hit the water. I live by the spreadsheet, and I breathe by the data. But 3 weeks ago, at exactly 6:12 in the morning, the logic of my world stopped making sense. The phone didn't just ring, it screamed against the silence of my bedroom. It was Peggy Sutton, my mother's neighbor in the quiet, moss-draped suburbs of Savannah, Georgia. Peggy is 70 years old and retired from the postal service. She doesn't do frantic, and she certainly doesn't call before the sun is up unless the world is ending. Her voice was a thin, vibrating wire of panic. She told me my mother's house on Forsyth Street had been attuned for 72 hours. No lights at night. No movement in the kitchen during the morning tea. Most importantly, 3 days of newspapers were yellowing on the porch, and the mailbox was choking on its own contents. My mother, Maggie, is 82 years old. She has mid-stage Alzheimer's. She is a woman who occasionally forgets her own middle name but can recite the Dewey Decimal System from her 35 years as a librarian. She is also a woman who cannot walk to the end of her own driveway without a steadying hand on her elbow. I called my brother, Elias, 7 times in a row. I watched the call timer tick up, the digital silence on the other end feeling heavier with every failed connection. When he finally picked up on the 8th try, there was no hello, no, I was sleeping. Just 5 words that turned my blood into slush. She wandered off. Go home. My mother didn't wander off. My mother couldn't wander off. In my world, when someone tells you a cargo ship just sank without a storm in sight, it means someone pulled the plug on purpose. Elias told me to stop making a scene, to trust the saint of Savannah. The devoted son who stayed behind while I supposedly abandoned the family for a career in the north. But as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the gray Chicago skyline, my logistics brain was already calculating the transit time. What I found when I touched down in Georgia wasn't a confused old woman lost in a neighborhood. It was $340,000 scrubbed from her accounts, a high-end care facility that had no record of a Margaret Vance, and a brother who had been writing a fiction for an audience of one. If you've ever looked at a person you've known your whole life and realized you were staring at a stranger, then you know exactly how this story feels. To understand the weight of a disappearance, you have to understand the person who is gone. My mother, Maggie Vance, was the heartbeat of Forsyth Street. She was the woman who knew every child's reading level and every neighbor's favorite tea. But Alzheimer's is a thief that steals in increments. 3 years ago, it started taking the nouns. Then it took the dates. Eventually, it started taking the geography of her own home. She became a passenger in her own life, and my brother Elias volunteered to be the pilot. I agreed to the arrangement because it was the only thing that made sense on a spreadsheet. Elias lived 20 minutes away. He ran a successful local landscaping and development firm. He was the golden boy of the Savannah social scene, the man who shook hands at every charity gala and sat in the front pew of the Methodist church every Sunday. I was 700 miles away, tethered to a desk by a job that didn't allow for long-term absences. I sent $1,200 every month to cover the extra care Elias said she needed, the private nurses, the specialized meal deliveries, the premium medication. I trusted the manifest. I trusted the brother who told me, I've got this, Cass. You just keep the checks coming. But a few months ago, the data points started to skew. Our Sunday video calls, the ones where Mom would hum along to the radio while I told her about her granddaughter Lily, began to evaporate. Elias always had a reason. She's having a bad day, he'd say. The iPad is glitching. She's sleeping off a new medication. I told myself it was just the progression of the disease. I wanted to believe the pilot was still flying the plane. But after Peggy's call, I realized the plane had been empty for a long time. I landed at Savannah/Hilton Head International at 10:40 a.m. The air was thick and sweet with jasmine, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic cold of the terminal. I didn't call Elias to tell him I was coming. In logistics, if you want to know what's really happening at a warehouse, you don't call the manager, you show up at the loading dock unannounced. I grabbed a rental car and drove straight to Forsyth Street. The moss on the oak seemed to hang lower, like heavy curtains closing on a play that had already ended. I pulled into the driveway and felt the first true jolt of terror. The lawn, usually manicured to Elias's exacting standards, was shaggy and overgrown. The flower beds Mom loved were choked with weeds. The house didn't look lived in, it looked like an asset that was being liquidated. The spare key was exactly where it had been since 1994, tucked inside a hollowed-out plastic rock behind a hydrangea bush. I stepped inside, and the silence hit me like a physical wall. It wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. The air was stale, smelling of old dust and the ghost of lavender perfume. I walked into the kitchen. The refrigerator was a graveyard. A carton of milk expired 3 weeks ago, a half-eaten sandwich turned into a science project, and a bowl of fruit that had collapsed into a sugary rot. Then, I saw the pill organizer on the granite counter. It was a standard 7-day tray, color-coded for morning and night. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Every single compartment was full. The blood pressure pills, the Aricept for her memory, the low-dose aspirin, all sitting in their little plastic cells, untouched. My mother cannot remember to put on shoes, but she was supposed to be under 24/7 care. If she had wandered off on Sunday as Elias claimed, why were the pills for Thursday and Friday still there? My logistics brain clicked into high gear. This wasn't a sudden wandering. This was a scheduled departure that had happened days before Peggy noticed the lights were out. I walked into Mom's bedroom. The bed was made with a terrifying, military precision. Tucked so tight the sheets didn't have a single wrinkle. My mother hasn't made a bed like that in a decade. Someone had scrubbed this room. Someone had wiped away the evidence of a human being living here. I moved to the small mahogany desk in the corner, the one where Mom used to write her thank you notes. Most of the drawers were empty, but tucked under a stack of old Library of Congress newsletters was a single, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't addressed to Maggie Vance. It was addressed to Margaret Thorne, my mother's maiden name. A name she hasn't used since 1968. The return address was a place called the Cedars Luxury Living in a county 2 hours away. I opened it, my hands shaking so hard the paper rattled. It was an invoice for initial intake fees and sequestration services. The amount was $15,000. And at the bottom, in the bold, arrogant ink of my brother's fountain pen, was his signature. Elias hadn't lost her. He had filed her away under a name no one would ever think to search for. I spent the next hour in that silent house, not crying, but hunting. I needed to see the manifest. I needed to see where the $1,200 a month and the $340,000 in Mom's life savings were actually going. I knew the login to her Wells Fargo account, I'd helped her set it up years ago. I pulled up the app on my phone, my breath hitching as the loading circle spun. When the screen finally flickered to life, the number at the top didn't make sense. It was $1,402.11. $1,400. 10 months ago, that account held over $400,000. I scrolled through the transaction history, and the red numbers started to bleed together. Transfers to Vance Landscaping and Design. Transfers to E. Vance Personal. Large withdrawals at a casino in North Carolina. A $25,000 payment to a private silent partner listed only as a MER. It was a total liquidation. Elias hadn't just been a bad pilot, he had been stripping the plane for parts while it was still in the air. I heard a car door slam out front. I moved to the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain just a fraction of an inch. A black Mercedes SUV was idling in the driveway. Elias stepped out, looking every bit the Savannah gentleman in a tailored linen blazer and polished loafers. He didn't look like a man who had lost his mother. He looked like a man who was arriving to check on a piece of real estate. He walked up the porch steps, his whistle carrying through the quiet afternoon air, a jaunty, casual tune that made my skin crawl. He reached for the door handle, and I realized I was standing in a house with a man who had erased our mother, emptied her life, and told me to stop making a scene. He stepped into the foyer, the sunlight from the open door silhouetting him against the dust motes. He stopped, his nose wrinkling at the stale air. Then his eyes drifted to the kitchen counter, where I had left the cream-colored envelope sitting in plain sight. His body went rigid. The jaunty whistle died in his throat. I stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, my phone in one hand and the forensic evidence of his betrayal in the other. He didn't jump. He didn't gasp. He just looked at me with a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. The same smile he used to win over the board of the Methodist Church. "Cassidy," he said, his voice smooth as bourbon. "I told you to stay in Chicago. You always did have a habit of looking at things that didn't concern you. Now, why don't you put that piece of paper down before you see something you really can't handle?" Elias didn't move. He stood there in the foyer of our childhood home, the Savannah sun spilling in behind him, casting a long, distorted shadow that stretched across the hardwood floors to the tips of my shoes. He looked exactly like the man the local newspapers loved to profile, the saint of Forsyth Street, the visionary developer, the son who stayed. But looking at him now, through the lens of a $400,000 theft and a ghost white house, the charcoal suit and the perfectly coiffed hair looked like a costume. A very expensive, very desperate costume. "I'm concerned about our mother, Elias," I said, my voice coming out with a clinical precision that seemed to catch him off guard. "I'm concerned about the fact that her blood pressure medication hasn't been touched in 4 days. I'm concerned about the $340,000 that evaporated from her savings. And I'm deeply, personally concerned about why she's registered at a facility 2 hours away under the name Margaret Thorne." He let out a short, dry chuckle, the kind of sound a man makes when he's trying to decide if he should keep lying or start threatening. He stepped further into the house, closing the heavy oak door behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a cell door locking. "You always were a creature of the spreadsheet, Cassidy. You see a number move, and you think you've uncovered a conspiracy. You don't see the reality of the day-to-day. You don't see the cost of a memory that's rotting from the inside out. Do you have any idea what it costs to keep a woman like that in a high-end facility without the state sniffing around? Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed to keep the Vance name out of the mud?" "Sacrificed?" I stepped toward him, the cream-colored envelope trembling in my hand. "You didn't sacrifice anything. You liquidated her. You treated her like a distressed asset. You moved her to the Cedars because it's a hole in the wall in a county where nobody knows the name Vance. You changed her name so I couldn't find her. You didn't protect her, Elias. You hid the evidence of your own greed." His face shifted then. The practiced, bourbon-smooth mask of the Southern gentleman didn't just slip, it dissolved. His jaw tightened, and his eyes, the same shade of slate as mine, turned cold and flat. "You live 700 miles away, Cassidy. You send your little checks and you think that gives you a seat at the table. It doesn't. I am the one who stood here while she forgot who I was. I am the one who managed the Vance Ventures through a recession you didn't even feel in Chicago. If I moved some capital around to keep the family firm afloat, it was for the benefit of all of us. Including you. Including your daughter's inheritance. Don't you dare bring Lily into this," I hissed. "You used Mom's life insurance payout to cover your gambling debts at a North Carolina casino. I've seen the manifest, Elias. I've seen the transfers to Mr. Who is Mr.? Is that the silent partner you've been bleeding her dry for? Is that why the Saint of Savannah is suddenly so interested in a house he hasn't stepped foot in for days?" He didn't answer. He just looked at the kitchen counter, at the empty pill organizer, and then back at me. There was a calculation happening behind his eyes, a logistics problem of his own. He realized I wasn't just a grieving sister, I was an auditor. And in his world, auditors were the only thing more dangerous than the truth. He took a slow breath, his posture relaxing into a stance that was far too casual for the conversation. "You're tired, Cass. The flight, the stress, it's making you see things that aren't there. Why don't you go back to the hotel? Let me handle the move. I'll take you to see her tomorrow. I promise. She's safe. She's resting. I'm not going to a hotel, and I'm not waiting until tomorrow," I said, reaching for my car keys on the counter. "I'm going to the Cedars. And if you try to stop me, the first call I make won't be to a lawyer. It'll be to the Savannah Morning News. I wonder how the Methodist board will feel when they find out their golden boy is a common thief who erases his own mother for a blackjack hand." I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his linen blazer. He didn't move to grab me, but I felt the heat of his gaze on the back of my neck. As I pushed through the front door and stepped out into the humid Georgia afternoon, I heard him speak one last time, his voice low and devoid of all its previous warmth. "The Cedars isn't a place for visitors, Cassidy. And the people I owe money to, they don't care about the morning news. You should have stayed in Chicago. You really should have stayed in the spreadsheets." The drive to Lake County felt like a descent into a forgotten part of the state, a place where the Spanish moss hung like tattered lace and the roads were lined with rusted signs for citrus groves that had died decades ago. My logistics brain was screaming. Every data point I'd collected in the last 6 hours was pointing toward a catastrophic system failure. $340,000 doesn't just disappear into family firm expenses. It gets swallowed. It gets burned. And MR, the silent partner, was the hole in the center of the map. I pulled into the parking lot of a local Wells Fargo on the way, the same branch Mom had used for 20 years. I needed more than just a phone app summary, I needed the physical paper. I needed the signatures. I walked into the lobby, the cold air conditioning a sharp sting against my skin. I asked for the branch manager. A woman in her mid-40s, wearing reading glasses on a silver chain, came out of a back office. She looked at my ID, then at the name on the account. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that made my heart hammer against my ribs. "I'd been expecting someone to come by. I can't give you a full statement without a formal subpoena, but I can tell you that we've flagged several transactions in the last 90 days. Mr. Elias Vance has durable power of attorney, so our hands were tied, but, well, the patterns were highly irregular." "Irregular how?" I leaned in, the smell of the bank, ink, old paper, and stale coffee, feeling like the scent of a crime scene. "Large cash withdrawals. Structured just below the reporting threshold. And several transfers to an offshore holding company. We tried to reach your mother for verification, but your brother told us she was in a specialized facility with no phone access. He provided a medical certificate." She paused, her eyes darting toward the security guard by the door. "Miss Vance, I shouldn't be telling you this, but you should speak with an elder law attorney immediately. And you might want to check the title on the Forsyth Street property. There was an inquiry about a secondary mortgage 3 weeks ago." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. A secondary mortgage. He wasn't just stripping the savings, he was selling the ground she stood on. I thanked her and walked back out to the car, the Georgia heat hitting me like a physical weight. I pulled up my laptop in the front seat, tethering to my phone, and began a search that had nothing to do with supply chains. MR Savannah Development. MR Holding Company. MR Gaming North Carolina. The search results were a sea of white noise until I hit a small legal notice in a back issue of a coastal trade journal. MR Associates, LLC. Principal, Marcus Rossi. My breath caught. Marcus Rossi. I knew that name. He wasn't a developer. He was a fixer for the regional gaming circuits, a man whose name was whispered in the same breath as predatory lending and high-stakes debt collection. Elias hadn't just gambled away the money, he had borrowed against a future he didn't own from a man who didn't accept apologies. I looked at the cream-colored envelope again. The Cedars. I realized then that the sequestration wasn't just to keep me away. It was to keep Maggie Vance away from the people Rossi would send to collect. Elias hadn't moved her for her health, he had moved her because she was his last piece of collateral. And in his world, collateral was only valuable as long as it was hidden. I arrived at the Cedars just as the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, bloody streaks across the horizon. It wasn't a luxury living facility. It was a renovated motel at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. There were no orchids on the windowsills here. There were no nurses in crisp whites. Just a bored-looking man in a stained polo shirt sitting in a booth by the gate. "I'm here to see Margaret Thorne," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. He checked a clipboard, his eyes sluggish. "No visitors for Thorne. Family orders. Guardian says she's too confused for company." "I am her daughter," I said, leaning out the window. "And I have a court-mandated wellness check pending. You can let me in now, or we can wait for the sheriff's department to arrive and start asking about your licensing." It was a bluff, a logistics manager's gamble, but it worked. He buzzed the gate open with a grunt. I drove through, the tires kicking up a cloud of red Georgia dust. The building was a long, low-slung concrete block, the windows covered in heavy security mesh. I walked into the lobby, which consisted of a desk, a plastic fern, and the overwhelming smell of bleach and floor wax. A woman behind the desk looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and practiced indifference. "Can I help you?" "Room 22, I said, reading the number from the corner of the envelope I'd found. "Margaret Thorne." She hesitated, her hand moving toward a phone. "I need to check with the administrator. Mr. Vance was very specific about the privacy protocols." "Mr. Vance is currently under investigation for financial exploitation," I lied, my voice ringing with a conviction I didn't feel. "I suggest you show me to that room before you become an accessory." She paled, her hand dropping from the phone. She led me down a narrow, dimly lit hallway where the air felt thick and uncirculated. We reached a heavy steel door with a small wired glass window. She turned a key in the lock, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet hall. The door swung open, and I stepped inside. The room was small, barely larger than a walk-in closet. There were no photographs on the nightstand. No books from the library. Just a single bed with a thin, institutional blanket and a small television bolted to the wall. And there, sitting in a plastic chair by the window, was my mother. She looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner. Her hair, usually so perfectly set, was flat and dull. She was staring at her own reflection in the security mesh, her fingers tracing the wire. She didn't turn around when I entered. She didn't even flinch. "Mom?" I whispered, the word feeling like it was breaking in my throat. She turned slowly, her eyes drifting over my face with a heartbreaking vacancy. She looked at me for a long, agonizing 10 seconds, the silence in the room so heavy I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Then, a tiny spark of recognition flickered in the back of her gaze, a ghost of the woman who used to Dewey Decimal my life into order. "Miranda?" she asked, her voice a thin, raspy thread. "Miranda. My mother's sister. The aunt who died 20 years ago." She didn't see Cassidy. She didn't see her daughter. She saw a ghost from a past she couldn't quite reach. I sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. It was cold, the skin like parchment over bone. "It's Cassidy, Mom. I'm here. I'm going to take you home." She looked at me, then at the door, her eyes filling with a sudden, sharp terror that wasn't born of dementia. She leaned in, her breath smelling of medicinal tea and fear, and whispered into my ear, her voice barely a breath. "You shouldn't be here, baby. He's coming back. And he isn't alone this time. He said the saint had a debt to pay, and I was the interest." I froze. He isn't alone. The logistics of the betrayal had just shifted again. Elias wasn't just hiding her from me. He was holding her for someone else. And as the sound of a heavy SUV tires crunching on the gravel outside reached the room, I realized the Saint of Savannah hadn't just gambled away the money. He had gambled the only thing left that Marcus Rossi could use to make a point. And the gate I had bluffed my way through was currently being locked from the outside. The gravel outside room 22 didn't just crunch, it screamed under the weight of a heavy wheelbase. In my world, logistics is about the rhythm of arrivals and departures, the predictable pulse of the supply chain. But this sound was offbeat, aggressive, and final. I stood in that cramped, bleach-scented box of a room, my mother's parchment-thin hand trembling in mine. She wasn't looking at me anymore, she was looking at the reinforced door, her eyes wide with a lucidity that only comes from pure, unadulterated terror. The interest, she whispered again, the word catching in her throat like a burr. He said I was the interest. The realization hit me with the force of a high-speed collision. Elias hadn't just moved her to hide the theft, he had collateralized her. My brother, the man who sat in the front pew of the Methodist church, had traded our mother's safety to buy himself one more week of breathing room from Marcus Rossi. I looked at the security mesh on the window. It wasn't there to keep her from wandering, it was there to keep her in. I reached into my bag, my fingers fumbling for my phone, but the signal bar was a hollow, empty gray. Dead zone. Deliberate or geographical, it didn't matter. I was off the grid, trapped in a renovated motel with a woman who didn't know what year it was, while the fixer for the regional gaming circuits pulled into the lot. I heard the heavy thud of a car door, then another. No jaunty whistles this time. Just the low, rhythmic murmur of men who move with a singular, violent purpose. I stepped to the door, pressing my ear against the cold steel. The administrator's voice, the woman who had looked so pale only minutes ago, was a frantic, high-pitched warble. Mr. Rossi, I told the other lady she couldn't be here, but she had a sharp, wet slap cut her off, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. The administrator didn't scream. She just went quiet. Elias is a dead man walking, a new voice rumbled, deep and sandpaper rough. It wasn't Elias. It was the MR from the bank statements. Marcus Rossi. He thinks he can play hide-and-seek with a $250,000 debt? He thinks he can use a library lady as a shield? Open the door, Brenda. Let's see what the saint left us to hold on to. The jingle of keys against the lock felt like a countdown. My logistics brain, the one that calculates exit strategies for million-dollar freights, was spinning in a void. There was no back door. No fire escape. Just a narrow hallway and a man who didn't accept apologies. I looked at my mother, her face a mask of ancient fear, and I realized that if I didn't find a manifest for our survival in the next 10 seconds, the Vance family story was going to end in a Lake County motel room with the lights turned out. The lock turned with a heavy, mechanical finality, but I didn't wait for the door to swing. I put my weight against the steel, throwing the deadbolt from the inside just as the handle turned. The door bucked against the frame, a heavy shoulder slamming into the other side. Cassidy. It was Elias. His voice was frantic, stripped of its bourbon-smooth arrogance. Cassidy, open the door. You don't understand what's happening. Rossi, wait, she's my sister, she's not part of this. She's a witness now, Saint, Rossi's voice came back, cold and terrifyingly calm. And witnesses are expensive. Open the door, or I let the boys use the sledge. Your choice. I backed away from the door, my heart a frantic drum in my chest. I looked at the small television bolted to the wall, the heavy metal bracket anchored into the concrete block. I looked at the plastic chair. I looked at the cream-colored envelope. In my world, when a system fails, you don't try to fix the old one. You scavenge the parts to build something new. I grabbed the heavy mahogany desk chair and wedged it under the door handle, the wood groaning under the pressure as the door took another hit. Mom, I whispered, kneeling beside her. I need you to listen to me. Do you remember the library? Do you remember how we used to hide in the stacks during the summer storms? She blinked, the name Miranda still hovering on her lips, but she nodded. The spark of the librarian was still there, buried under the fog. We're in the stacks, Mom. And the big storm is here. I need you to get under the bed. Now. She didn't argue. She moved with a surprising, panicked agility, sliding her thin frame into the shadows beneath the institutional frame just as a heavy crack echoed through the room. The wood of the chair was splintering. I stood in the center of the room, my mind a whirlwind of data and desperation. I had the bank records. I had the MR connection. I had the proof of the secondary mortgage. But I was 3 hours from the Savannah sheriff and 30 seconds from a man who liquidated people for a living. I reached for the heavy television, gripping the sides of the old-fashioned tube, my muscles screaming as I wrenched it upward. The bracket held for a second, then the bolts groaned and tore free from the cinder block in a cloud of gray dust. It weighed 50 pounds, a clumsy, glass-heavy anchor. I stood by the door, the weight of the past pulling at my arms, as the chair finally snapped and the steel door flew inward. Elias stumbled in first, his linen blazer torn at the shoulder, his face a map of bruises and desperation. Behind him stood a man in a sharp, dark suit, his eyes as black and empty as a deep-sea trench. Marcus Rossi. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like a CEO of a very different kind of supply chain. He looked at me, then at the empty plastic chair, then at the heavy television I was cradling like a weapon. He didn't flinch. He just smiled, that slow, chilling expression I'd seen on Elias earlier, but this one was real. The logistics manager, Rossi purred, stepping over the wreckage of the chair. Elias told me you were the smart one. Tell me, Cassidy, does your spreadsheet tell you what happens to the interest when the principal disappears? The air in the room was thick with the scent of ozone from the torn TV wires and the cold, metallic smell of Rossi's cologne. Elias was hunched in the corner, a broken version of the man who had whistled on the porch only hours ago. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a miracle I didn't have. I can get the money, Marcus, Elias wheezed. The Forsyth house, the mortgage is going through. Another week. Just give me another week. The Forsyth house is a hollow shell, Elias, Rossi said, not taking his eyes off me. Your sister already visited the bank. The title is flagged. The manifest is closed. You've got nothing left but the library lady and the logistics manager. And I think the manager here is worth a lot more to me as a bargaining chip with the Vance Ventures board than a rotting motel room. He stepped toward me, his hand reaching into his blazer. Put the TV down, Cassidy. You're an auditor, not a brawler. Let's talk about a new contract. I don't sign contracts with fixed interest, I said, my voice steadier than I ever imagined it could be. I looked at Elias, then at the space under the bed where my mother was a silent, trembling shadow. I realized then that Elias hadn't just been stealing the money, he'd been selling the very foundation of who we were. He'd turned our mother into a line item. He'd turned our childhood home into a debt. And now, he was watching them He'd invited into our lives prepare to liquidate his sister. I didn't put the TV down. I swung it. Not at Rossi, but at the window. The heavy glass tube shattered against the security mesh, a spray of sparks and glass shards filling the room as the vacuum seal imploded. The mesh groaned but held. I swung again, the weight of the plastic and leaded glass tearing a hole in the wire. Mom, run! I screamed, but I knew she couldn't. I wasn't calling to her. I was calling to the board man in the gatehouse, hoping the sound of imploding electronics and breaking glass would trigger the one thing a privacy protocol couldn't ignore, a fire alarm. I ripped the dangling wires from the wall, sparking them against the thin, polyester curtains. A wall of orange flame surged upward, the cheap fabric vanishing in a roar of chemical heat. Rossi swore, stepping back as the smoke began to choke the small room. Elias scrambled toward the door, but Rossi's hand shot out, gripping him by the throat. You think a fire stops a debt, Saint? Rossi hissed, the calm mask finally cracking. This just raises the overhead. He looked at me through the smoke, his eyes narrowed. He didn't move toward me. He moved toward the bed. He knew. He knew exactly where the interest was hiding. He reached down, his fingers curling around the edge of the mattress, and I realized that the logistics of this betrayal were about to reach their most devastating peak. The fire was a distraction for the gatekeeper, but for Rossi, it was just a backdrop for the final liquidation. And as the bed began to lift, exposing the woman who had Dewey Decimaled my life, I saw something in my mother's hand, something she'd taken from the nightstand before she crawled into the dark. It wasn't a book. It was the heavy, brass-based lamp from the nightstand, and as Rossi leaned down, she didn't scream. She swung. Rossi took the hit directly across the temple, the brass base connecting with a sickening, hollow thud. He didn't fall, he folded, his body hitting the gray carpet like a sack of dead weight. Elias stood paralyzed, the orange light of the burning curtains dancing in his wide, terrified eyes. My mother scrambled out from under the frame, the lamp still gripped in her white-knuckled hands, her hair a wild halo of gray. For a second, the dementia was gone, replaced by the raw, ancestral instinct of a librarian who had spent 35 years protecting her stacks. She looked at me, then at Elias, then at the man unconscious on the floor. "The manifest," she wheezed, her voice a ghostly echo of my own. "Cassidy, the manifest is in the safe." "The safe?" I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the smoke-filled hallway. "Mom, what safe?" "We have to go." "The floorboard," she insisted, her strength surprising me as she pushed me toward the door. "In the foyer. Under the rug with the red birds. Your father didn't just leave insurance, baby. He left the ledger. The real one. The one the saint couldn't find." Elias's face went a translucent shade of green. The real ledger. The logistics of the Vance Ventures had always been a mystery to me, a series of successful developments that seemed to defy the local economy. I'd assumed it was Elias's vision. But as we burst out into the cool night air, the motel's fire klaxon finally beginning to wail, I realized the theft wasn't just $340,000. It was the entire history of the firm. My father hadn't built an empire, he'd built a vault. And Elias hadn't been stripping the plane. He'd been trying to break into the black box. I threw Mom into the passenger seat of the rental, the engine roaring to life as I slammed it into gear. Elias stood by the black SUV, the orange glow of the burning motel reflected in the polished paint. He looked at me, his hand reaching out as if to stop the car, but his eyes were fixed on the doorway where Marcus Rossi's men were emerging from the smoke. He was caught between the sister who knew his secret and the fixer who owned his life. I didn't wait for him to choose. I floored it, the red Georgia dust swallowing the motel as I raced back toward Savannah. But as I glanced at the dashboard, I saw the one thing my logistics brain had missed in the chaos. The GPS wasn't set to Forsyth Street anymore. Someone had tampered with the car while I was inside. The destination on the screen was a remote dock on the Savannah River, and the estimated time of arrival was exactly 12 minutes before the Saint's debt was officially due for collection. The dashboard of the rental car glowed with a sickly, digital blue, illuminating the countdown to a destination I hadn't chosen. 12 minutes. In my line of work, 12 minutes is the difference between a successful offload and a breach of contract. But on this backroad, flanked by the skeletal remains of cypress trees and the black, suffocating water of the Savannah River, 12 minutes felt like a countdown to an execution. I wrenched the steering wheel, trying to override the GPS, but the screen was locked. The haptic feedback fought me, the wheels pulling toward the river as if the car itself had been bought and paid for by Marcus Rossi. Someone had accessed the internal systems while I was inside that motel room. A remote override. A digital tether. My mother sat beside me, the brass lamp still clutched in her lap like a scepter. She wasn't looking at the road. She was looking at the letter she'd pulled from her pocket, the real manifest. "The red birds, Cassidy," she whispered, her voice gaining a terrifying, sharp clarity. "Your father knew the saint would try to pave over the swamp. He knew the money wouldn't be enough for a man who wants to own the horizon. He buried the truth where the tide doesn't reach." I looked at her, and for a second, the librarian wasn't just back, she was in charge. She wasn't a victim of a fading mind, she was the keeper of a vault that Elias had spent years trying to crack with a sledgehammer. I shoved the car into neutral, the engine roaring in protest as I slammed my foot on the brake. We skidded, the tires screaming against the asphalt, stopping just inches from a rusted pier that jutted into the black water like a broken finger. This was the coordinates. The remote dock. I killed the lights, the darkness of the river swamp swallowing us instantly. In the distance, I heard the low, rhythmic thrum of a boat engine, a deep-seated vibration that rattled the glass of the windshield. Rossi's collection team wasn't coming by land. They were coming by water. I grabbed the brass lamp from Mom's lap and the old ledger from the dashboard. "We're getting out, Mom. Now." We scrambled into the brush, the mud sucking at my shoes, the air thick with the smell of decay and salt. I looked back at the rental car. The interior light was still on, a glowing beacon in the dark. And then, I saw the headlights of the black SUV appearing at the top of the levee. Elias. He hadn't stayed at the motel. He'd followed the tether. He was the one who had set the destination. He wasn't running from Rossi anymore, he was delivering the interest to the collection point. As I pulled my mother deeper into the shadows of the Spanish moss, I realized the Saint of Savannah had one last logistics problem to solve: how to make sure the only two people who knew about the redbirds vanished into the silt of the Savannah River. The swamp at night is a sensory overload of things that shouldn't exist. Every snap of a twig sounded like a bone breaking, every ripple in the water felt like a hand reaching out. I led my mother through the knee-high sawgrass, my eyes fixed on the silhouette of an old, abandoned fishing shack 100 yards down the bank. In my world, when the primary route is compromised, you look for the bypass. You find the gap in the schedule. But here, the only schedule was the rising tide and the approaching drone of that boat. "Cassidy, stop," my mother hissed, pulling me back behind a massive, lightning-scarred oak. She pointed toward the pier. The black SUV had stopped. Elias stepped out, his white linen blazer a ghostly blur in the moonlight. He wasn't alone. Two men stood behind him, their silhouettes blocky and utilitarian. They weren't Rossi's high-end fixers, they were local muscle, the kind of men who work the night shift at the Savannah docks. Elias held a flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark like a blade. "Cassidy," he called out, his voice echoing off the water. "I know you're here. Just give me the ledger. Rossi is gone, I took care of it. We can go back to Forsyth. We can fix the accounts. Just give me the book." "He's lying," I whispered to the dark. I could see the boat now, a low-profile skiff, no lights, cutting a silver wake through the black water. It wasn't Rossi. It was the silent partner. The MR from the bank statements wasn't just Marcus Rossi. It was a joint venture. My brother hadn't been bullied into this, he'd been the architect. The gambling debts were a cover, a convenient narrative to explain why the money was gone while he built a secondary empire on the bones of the Vance family firm. He didn't want to save Mom, he wanted to ensure that no other living relative's box was checked permanently. I looked at the ledger in my hand. The cover was worn leather, embossed with a small, faded pair of cardinals, the red birds. I flipped it open, my phone's flashlight shielded by my palm. It wasn't a list of names or dates. It was a series of topographic maps. My father, the surveyor, had mapped the Savannah Basin long before the developers arrived. He'd found the environmental fault lines, the places where the soil was too toxic or too unstable for the massive luxury condos Elias was currently building. My father had kept the data hidden, using it as a black box to keep the firm honest. If the truth about those foundations came out, the Vance Ventures wouldn't just be bankrupt, they'd be criminal. Elias wasn't stripping the plane for parts, he was trying to burn the black box before the crash was discovered. "The silt," my mother whispered, her hand trembling on my arm. "He's building on the silt, Cassidy. He thinks the concrete will hold the lie down, but the river always remembers." A heavy splash echoed from the pier. The skiff had arrived. I saw Elias step onto the dock, leaning down to speak to someone on the boat. The flashlight beam swung toward our oak tree, the light grazing the moss inches from my face. They were starting the sweep. I looked at the river, then at the fishing shack, and then at the ledger. I realized then that my logistics brain had one final calculation to make. I couldn't outrun them, and I couldn't outhide them. I had to change the manifest. I had to make the cargo too heavy for the saint to carry. We moved with a rhythmic, desperate silence toward the shack, the wood of the structure groaning as I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dried fish and kerosene. I found a rusted lantern on a hook, a few inches of fuel still sloshing in the base. In the corner, a stack of old burlap sacks and a coil of rotting rope. I looked at my mother. Her eyes were clear, the fear replaced by a cold, librarian's resolve. "The archive," she said, nodding toward the lantern. "Burn the manifest, Cassidy. Let the river have the rest." I struck a match, the small flame illuminating the maps of the Savannah basin. I saw the red birds marked on the unstable zones, the exact coordinates of the new Eagle Ridge subdivision. Thousands of lives built on a foundation of mud and greed. If I burned this, I saved my brother from prison, but I condemned 1,000 families to a catastrophic collapse. If I kept it, I had the leverage to destroy him, but I had to get it out of the swamp. The flashlight beams were sweeping the grass outside the shack now, the voices of the men getting closer. "She's in there," I heard Elias say, his voice high and thin. "The shack. Check the shack." I didn't burn the maps. I tore them out, stuffing the thin, translucent paper into my mother's shoes, under the soles. The ledger itself, the heavy leather cover, I soaked in the kerosene. I stood in the center of the room as the door was kicked open, the lantern light flaring as the Saint of Savannah stepped into the room. He was alone this time, the muscle staying at the door. He looked at me, then at the kerosene-soaked book in my hand, then at the flickering match. "Give it to me, Cass," he pleaded, his face a mask of sweat and moonlight. "Give me the book, and you and Mom walk to the levee. I'll give you the car. I'll give you $1 million from the offshore account. Just give me the data." "The data is already gone, Elias," I said, dropping the match. The kerosene flared instantly, the leather ledger becoming a roaring ball of orange flame in the center of the shack. Elias screamed, lunging for the fire, his hands clawing at the burning pages as they curled into ash. I grabbed my mother's hand, lurching past him in the confusion of the smoke. We hit the door, the muscle outside momentarily blinded by the flare. We didn't run for the levee. We ran for the water. We hit the skiff just as the engine was idling, the man at the controls, a faceless silhouette in a dark hoodie, reaching for a weapon. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the brass lamp. I swung the heavy base with everything I had, the metal connecting with the man's shoulder, sending him tumbling into the black water with a choked cry. I scrambled into the driver's seat, my fingers finding the throttle. In my world, I don't drive boats. I track them. But the logistics of a throttle and a tiller are universal. I shoved the lever forward, the skiff leaping away from the pier as the shack behind us became a roaring bonfire. I saw Elias emerge from the doorway, his blazer on fire, his hands reaching for the water as the Saint of Savannah finally watched his manifest turn to smoke. We roared down the river, the wind whipping my hair, the cold spray hitting my face. I looked at my mother. She was sitting in the bow, her eyes fixed on the horizon, the maps of the Eagle Ridge disaster tucked safely beneath her feet. We were clear. We were off the map. But as I checked the dash of the skiff, I saw a small, blinking red light under the steering column. Not a GPS tether. A timer. And as the digital display ticked down from 5 seconds to 4, I realized that Marcus Rossi didn't just accept interest or principal. He accepted liquidations. And the skiff wasn't a getaway vehicle. It was a payload. 4 seconds. In logistics, 4 seconds is the margin of error for a high-speed sorting arm. It's the blink of an eye before a collision. But as I stared at that blinking red timer under the skiff's console, 4 seconds was the countdown to our erasure. Marcus Rossi didn't just want the money or the ledger, he wanted the audit closed permanently. A boat explosion in the middle of a swamp is a clean line item. It's a missing at sea manifest that no one ever reopens. I didn't think. I reacted with the raw, lizard brain instinct of a woman who has spent a lifetime calculating force and trajectory. I reached across the seat, grabbed my mother by the life vest, and yelled one word, "Jump." We hit the black, sulphurous water of the Savannah River just as the sky turned a blinding, gasoline orange. The shock of the cold was like a physical blow, a sudden liquidation of every sense I possessed. Then came the roar. A concussive wave that traveled through the water, vibrating my ribs until I thought they'd shatter. I fought my way to the surface, my lungs screaming for air that didn't taste like fuel. The skiff was gone, replaced by a floating graveyard of burning fiberglass and oil slicks. I looked for the gray halo of my mother's hair. "Mom." I choked out, the water thick and oily in my mouth. A hand broke the surface 10 feet away, clawing at a piece of the seat cushion. I swam toward her, my muscles cramping in the sudden, deep-seated chill of the river. I grabbed her, pulling her chin above the water. She was coughing, her eyes wild, but she was alive. And in the flickering light of the burning wreckage, I saw her shoes, the ones stuffed with the maps of the Eagle Ridge disaster, were still on her feet. The manifest was still with us. We drifted with the current, staying in the shadows of the overhanging cypress knees. On the bank, the shack was a skeletal pyre. I saw the silhouette of the black SUV idling near the pier. Elias was there, standing at the water's edge, watching the flames. He didn't look like a man in mourning. He looked like a man checking a balance sheet. He waited for 5 minutes, watching the debris settle into the silt, before he turned and walked back to the car. The Saint of Savannah thought the interest had been paid in full. He didn't know that in my world, a lost shipment is only a loss until the salvage crew arrives. And I was the only salvage crew the Vance family had left. We crawled onto a muddy bank 3 miles downstream, the sunrise beginning to bleed a bruised purple across the horizon. My mother sat in the mud, shivering, her fingers tracing the patterns of the moss. But when she looked at me, the vacancy was gone. "The courthouse, Cassidy," she whispered. "The sheriff doesn't answer to the Saint. He answers to the county line." We weren't going back to Forsyth Street. We were going to the one place where a librarian's records and a logistics manager's data points could finally be filed into a permanent record. The walk to the Highway 17 bypass was a 5-hour slog through a world that wanted us dead, but by noon, we were standing in the lobby of the Chatham County Sheriff's Office. I didn't look like an executive. I looked like a woman who had been dragged through the bowels of a swamp, covered in mud, smelling of wood smoke and failure. I walked up to the glass partition and set my mother's shoes on the counter. "My name is Cassidy Vance," I said, my voice rasping like a rusted hinge. "I'm here to report a catastrophic system failure in the Vance Ventures. And I have the black box right here." The next 12 hours were a clinical, high-speed liquidation of my brother's life. I sat in an interview room with 2 detectives and a representative from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. I laid out the manifest. The bank statements. The MR transfers. The forged secondary mortgage. And then, I pulled the translucent maps from the soles of my mother's shoes. I showed them the red bird zones, the unstable silt where 1,000 families were currently sleeping in homes that were slowly sinking into the Georgia mud. The reaction was a silent, professional horror. The Saint of Savannah hadn't just stolen $340,000, he had built a death trap on a foundation of forged environmental reports. By 4 p.m., a warrant was issued. By 6 p.m., the black SUV was intercepted on the Talmadge Memorial Bridge. Elias didn't go out with a jaunty whistle. He went out in zip ties, his white linen blazer stained with the ash of the shack he'd tried to burn. He looked at the cameras, then at the detectives, and then, for one fleeting second, he looked at me through the glass of the observation room. He didn't smile. The Saint finally realized that when the auditor arrives, the costume doesn't matter. The big reveal wasn't just the theft or the unstable soil. It was the discovery in the basement of the Forsyth Street house 3 days later. The sheriff's team found the floorboard under the rug with the red birds. Inside wasn't just a ledger. It was a life insurance policy my father had taken out 20 years ago, not for himself, but for the firm. A policy that paid out only if the environmental integrity of the developments was compromised. Elias hadn't been trying to fix the business, he'd been waiting for the first house to collapse so he could collect the ultimate payday. He'd been betting on the deaths of his own clients. The fallout was total. The Vance Ventures went into a forced receivership. The Eagle Ridge subdivision was evacuated, 1,000 families moved into temporary housing while the state began the massive task of stabilizing the soil. Marcus Rossi disappeared into the regional gaming underworld, a ghost once more, leaving Elias to face a mountain of felonies alone. My mother, Margaret Vance, was moved into a high-end memory care facility in Raleigh, 15 minutes from my house. No security mesh. No thorn alias. Just a room with orchids on every windowsill and a library card with her real name on it. I sat with her yesterday, a Sunday afternoon. The sun was streaming through the window, the air smelling of lavender and old books. She was humming crazy along with the radio, her fingers tracing the edge of the leather ledger I'd managed to salvage from the mud. She looked at me, and for the first time in my life, she didn't see Miranda. She didn't see a ghost. She saw the logistics manager. "Did we get the cargo home, baby?" she asked. "Yes, Mom," I said, taking her hand. "The manifest is closed." I realized then that protecting a family isn't about the spreadsheets or the bank accounts. It's about the foundation. It's about being willing to burn the shack to save the truth. Elias is in a cell in Reedsville now, waiting for a trial that will last years. He sends me letters, but I don't open them. In my world, when a contract is breached this severely, you don't renegotiate. You move on to the next shipment. I'm Cassidy Vance. I still manage supply chains. I still live by the data. But I know now that the most important trail isn't the one that leads to a profit margin. It's the one that leads you back to the woman who taught you how to read in the first place. And as I watched my mother turn the page of a book she'll forget tomorrow, I realized that some cargo is too precious to ever be liquidated. Some things, like the memory of a red bird on a stable branch, are the only foundations that actually hold. I looked out at the Raleigh skyline, the lights of the city flickering on like a promise. The logistics of the Vance family had finally reached a state of rest. The saint was gone. The pilot was home. And the manifest. The manifest was finally, beautifully, empty.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.